Welcome to the People Leader Accelerator Podcast. I'm Executive Coach Jess Yuen, joined by my co-host, the co-founder and managing partner of People Leader Accelerator, Andrew Bartlow. On this show, we dive deep with business and HR leaders to uncover what really works when it comes to building high-performing organizations, navigating leadership challenges, and making better management decisions. Whether you're the first people leader at a startup or a seasoned executive at a company with scale, you'll find practical insights you can apply right away. For show notes and free bonus resources, visit peopleleaderaccelerator.com/podcast. And if you're looking for hands-on support from developing your leaders to creating a high-performance culture to hiring the right people, visit us at peopleleaderaccelerator.com. We'd love to help. Let's get into today's episode.
Daniel, really appreciate you being with Jess and I. Thank you for joining the People Leader Accelerator Podcast. And you're an alum of the program in cohort number 1. Yeah, 5 years ago. Really great.
Yep.
Been so great to follow you and your growth and actually see you in person finally for the first time in London over the summer. That was really nice. Over a kind of cold pint, which was really wonderful. Yeah. Hey, you'll do a better job than I will. You've had, some really interesting career moves. Would you give our audience a quick snapshot of some of those career moves?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. So essentially, I'm an IPO/debt lawyer turned startup operator turned people leader turned VC operator. So that's really the gist of it. Slightly more color. So I started out as a New York qualified lawyer. I sort of pretty quickly fell out of love with that work and craved to be closer to the business. The parts of it that I loved the most was spending time with CEOs and CFOs and really understanding their business so that we can describe it properly in the kind of offering memorandum prospectuses that we were putting together. So that kind of gave me a clue like, okay, this is sort of the right direction for me, head closer to the business. And then, I did a bunch of pretty generalist, pretty wild operator roles, including sort of living out of a suitcase at Lyft for a year, ultimately realizing that it was all about people. And that's kind of how I ended up in people leadership.
And you're being a little humble here too on your Lyft and WeWork chapters, because I know it's less people leadership specific, but can you give a bit of a snapshot of what were you doing? Because both of those companies went through kind of prolific scaling at the time and you were doing some really cool stuff there.
Yeah, sure. So look, Lyft was my first job out of law. I managed to convince now my friend Woody to give me a chance.
Woody Hartman?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Sorry. This is a small world moment that I think people will appreciate, but he and I were at McKinsey together as business analysts. We even worked on a project together and he's just awesome. So anyhow, small world.
Yeah, no, he's brilliant. And so he gave me a chance. I actually was going to launch Lyft in London. So the plan was come out to the US, learn the ropes, and then bring Lyft back to London. But then, strategy changed and I ended up on the kind of US launch team and had a suitcase of stuff. I moved from Airbnb to Airbnb and I was part of a really, really fun team getting operations going in each city. So was involved in the New York City launch, which was pretty crazy. We initially tried to launch with community drivers, but then the city did not like that. And so we then ended up canceling that launch and rebuilding it with professional drivers. Also part of the Miami, Philly launches as well. So it was basically a bit of everything, right? So working with sort of convincing drivers essentially to join the platform, keeping that relationship warm. So on the day that we do go live, they're actually they come live with us and actually start driving, but then also kind of driving up demand through local partnerships and things to make sure that we sort of have a successful initial period. So that was a really exciting experience. My role sort of centered around making sure that the buildings that we were setting up were ready to go on day one and ideally full, right? So obviously that asset, when it's empty or even partially empty, that carries significant opportunity cost. And so my role was to make sure that that doesn't happen. I'm basically full and thriving on day one.
That was the massive scaling of Lyft in multiple markets, in WeWork, when they were getting all the SoftBank dollars and growing
That's right.
crazy.
Yeah.
And then you and I met each other when you were at Vinted. And I don't know if everybody in our listener audience knows how big and complex Vinted is. Could you give a little snapshot of that gig?
Sure. So the core product was and remains today a C2C, so peer-to-peer secondhand fashion marketplace. When I joined, it was one of those companies pretty much off everybody's radar, headquartered in Lithuania, which is a country I had never been to, operating mostly in France and a few other markets, but really primarily in France, but doing pretty well. So like at that point, doing probably about 100 million in revenue. So fast forward sort of the end of my tenure, 4.5 years later, it's live, 20 plus markets. It's not just fashion, but other sort of shippable goods like home goods and electric sort of phones and things as well. And it's not only a marketplace, but it also has other sort of business units, including its own logistics/shipping arm. So most of the shipping done via the Vinted platform had historically been done through third-party partnerships with shipping companies, but then Vinted realized that actually it had an opportunity to verticalize into the shipping space itself and create value there. So that's sort of the second business unit. And then the third is payments as well. So much like with shipping, it is a key component of the transaction. And we sort of realized that ultimately by sort of internalizing more of that value chain, this will be also a value driver. And then last, we also got into kind of the luxury segment, which is again a different sort of business because it requires offline authentication. So if you're buying, a Louis Vuitton bag, you want to make sure that someone's looked at that thing and kind of confirmed that it's real and not a fake. Fraud is a huge issue in this industry. And so that involved more kind of physical operations on top of kind of logistics warehouses we already had. So the business became a lot more complex. It grew to about 800 million or so euros of revenue by the time I left. And it went from 400 to 2,200 employees.
Again, massive growth. So explosive growth, Lyft, explosive growth, WeWork,
Yeah.
Vinted, rocket ship. Did that for 4.5 years and said, like, let's press the pause button and figure out where to go from here. That was a marathon worth of sprints.
Yeah.
And
For
just
sure.
recently, I guess not that recent anymore, you moved on to a new gig that I'd love for you to share with the audience.
So I'm now at Atomico, which is a multi-stage venture capital firm focused primarily on Europe. And here I am part of the growth acceleration team. So essentially my role involves supporting founders across the portfolio with anything related to the stuff I do, which is essentially people, talent, culture, leadership. And really, I try to do this broad and deep. So partnering with a lot of these founders, but also going as deep as they need me. So that could involve anything from, should we introduce bonuses for non-sales employees? Or, hey, we're trying to hire our first CFO. Help us sort of think through how we go about this. What sort of profiles, what sort of archetypes do we go after? Where do we search? And actually like helping them with the searches. Whatever we can do to help them successful and therefore make ultimately Atomico successful as well is sort of the key aspect of my role.
Love
Just
it.
2 months into this role, I'm curious, how have you approached onboarding, even finding the role? I know there's a lot of people in our audience who are like, oh, that sounds like a pretty awesome
Yeah.
gig. Like, how do you go finding it?
Yeah.
Tell us more about that part of it.
Yeah. Well, I actually found it pretty serendipitously. I essentially wanted to get on the radar of VC talent folks. I knew that many of the sort of roles that I was hoping to get in sort of operator gigs often don't get advertised anymore. That's a big change that's sort of taken place over the past several years, at least to the extent I've noticed. Fewer roles get advertised these days. Sort of people sort of seem to try to fill them before putting them on the internet. And so I wanted to be on these folks' radar. And yeah, it was through those conversations that a role at the actual firm came up. So in terms of like what helped me land this role, I would say they were hoping to find someone who kind of had both early stage and also much later stage experience too. Our funds span investments at the sort of seed Series A level, but also much later stage. And the sorts of things that you're dealing with from a people perspective, there's quite a spectrum. And so I'm hoping to sort of leverage the breadth of that experience here.
Well, and no pressure. There's some big shoes that you're filling. I got to meet Dan Hines, who did that
Yes,
job for a
absolutely.
dozen years at Atomico when I
Yeah.
was with Masterclass. I did an interim CHRO role for Masterclass, and Dan was helpful.
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So no pressure. No pressure.
Yeah.
But I feel like the Portcos are really lucky to have somebody who has legal background, a business and strategic background, as well as the people lens too, to bring to the table. And I wonder, from your vantage point, what unfair advantage do you have given the experiences you had prior to getting into the people space?
Yeah, I guess the role is what you make it, you know? So different sort of archetypes exist, I think, in this VC role. Some folks kind of focus on the exec search piece. Others, like me, maybe more of an operator background, go broader and sort of that's kind of how I try to market myself. I mean, I've been in the founding team of a startup myself. And so have, I think, a fair amount of empathy for how difficult that experience is. And having been through sort of multiple business models, I can also, yeah, essentially come at these companies with an open mind, try to understand what makes their business tick and see what sort of people structures or new hires might make sense for them in a way that it might not for another company. So those are some of the ways I try to sort of market myself.
Well, again, like this huge array of tools in your utility belt that you can bring to play. Again, the deal attorney to the rapid expansion to like the people focus. Is there something that you've been able to leverage from these different functional opportunities along
Yeah,
the way that you can lean on that helps you be even
sure.
better at the next situation?
Yeah, I think so. So I think being a lawyer just beat attention to detail into me. I don't know if I was the most attention to detail sort of person before, but sort of being a lawyer, you just can't escape it. And it's super important, I think, in sort of a people leadership executive role because, anything that comes off your desk, you will be judged on. So making sure that every sentence makes sense and sort of everything is clear and crisp is, I think, an important skill. One thing that I also learned as a lawyer was just the difference between first principles thinking and reasoning by analogy. I wonder if it's because sort of how legal systems work in the UK, the US, etc. Lawyers tend to reason through precedent. Typically, the argument goes, here's evidence that this is market. This is the term that, other similar deals have used. Therefore, you should accept it that this is going to be our term as well. I always found that interesting because obviously the fact that it's market doesn't mean it makes sense. So that contrast sort of became clear to me, and I became very focused over time on not really leaning into analogies because just because it's been done that way by other companies, even if it's been done like that for a long time, it does not mean that actually is the right way to do it in your particular context. And so that's been something I've been trying to, bring into my sort of people leadership practice. Often I think we hide behind playbooks as people leaders. It's sort of comforting to know that there is a way to do performance management or compensation or whatever, but it may not be the right way for you. And it may not be that in your particular context, this is how you're going to create value. And so I've become very suspicious of reasoning by analogy, essentially.
Let me share a program that's built just for people like you. Leading people at a fast growth company is one of the hardest jobs out there. That's why we created People Leader Accelerator. It's a 16-week executive program that equips HR leaders with the tools, the frameworks, and the network to succeed. Plus, you'll join a lifetime community of alumni. Applications are open at peopleleaderaccelerator.com. And with that, let's return to today's episode. That resonates just so strongly. And you might recall, we talk about that in People Leader Accelerator and in the book that's the foundation for it around the danger of best practicing.
Yeah.
If some giant well-known organization does XYZ, like Google in the early days, the founders still used to interview everybody. And
Yeah.
you would see all these Silicon Valley companies try to adopt that air quote best practice because it allegedly worked for Google. And maybe it did in some ways, but it was also this giant bottleneck. And so, like, what are the trade-offs? What are the actual situations? Can your founders actually assess effectively for talent or not? So
Yeah.
context is often even more important than whatever the practice is. That's a nice takeaway.
I'm with you. I will add, however, that there's sort of a flip side to this, which is you also don't need to reinvent the wheel unless the wheel needs reinventing. Best practices are very often best practices because they actually work. And, people have tried and tested them and they seem to kind of hold up in different contexts. And like recognizing the context that you have sort of matches whatever pattern or context these other things have worked in is a good skill. There's no reason to do something differently just for the sake of doing it differently. In fact, yeah, sometimes you're better off doing something tried and tested, but you just have to always reevaluate, like, does it make sense or not?
That's fair. It's like there are these two magnetic poles that are attracting you to, like, let's just do the playbook. And then on the other side is, well, we're a unique startup and we're disrupting or democratizing whatever. And we're such a special snowflake that everything's got to be different for us.
Yeah,
And those are
exactly.
the two dangerous
Exactly.
ravines that you could fall into. And somewhere in the middle is this path that might be bumpy. You might not know where it's headed, but it's usually in between those two poles that we need to find our way.
The hardest part, though, too, is even if the best practice, and we're using lots of air quotes here around best practice, but like even if the best practice is maybe the best for the situation, it's also recognizing many of us have worked in founder led organizations where the founders are there because they had this like not tried and true, not best practice idea that went against the grain and is how this company even came into existence. I do think that balance is really important because I certainly have experience working with founders where they wanted us to reinvent the wheel. Like they wanted to go down, let's take it all the way down to brass tacks, first principles, and rebuild up the rationale of why we should do it the way maybe the industry does it, but maybe something else. And so also knowing who your leadership is as an
For
important
sure.
ingredient as well to take into consideration of where on that spectrum you end up playing, and communicating is the other piece of it. But I love that you're bringing up like both sides are important and it's helpful to stay open, but also know, hey, when do we not need to invest all of this time and effort to reinvent something that might be off the shelf pretty reasonable?
Yeah, exactly.
And boy, wouldn't it be great if there was an easy framework that you could just apply to say, like, use a best practice in this case, or make up your own thing in that case. And if you have one, please share it.
I think Daniel would be a rich man if he had the framework
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, maybe that's a to-do for us. We'll put it in the show notes. We'll put in the framework. Everybody, look in the show notes. Yeah.
Yes, it'll be called Silver Bullet.
That's right. Hey, Daniel, I'd love to follow up a little further. We talked a little bit about Vinted and its explosive growth, 8x in terms of revenue and about that in terms of headcount. Jess and I are based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've lived and worked in different places, but never abroad. I'm really curious about scaling outside the US. I guess you do have a comparison because you did that with Lyft in the US. What's different about scaling in Europe and the UK and in other markets?
And especially starting in France. I mean, France has a lot of different rules and regulations than in the US as well.
Yeah. Maybe I'll focus this answer on the organizational piece slash people piece. To me, like perhaps the number one thing is I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, this could be a wrong assumption, but I'm not sure people in the Valley necessarily realize just how different European cultures are within each other, between each other. There's genuinely massive differences in terms of how people conduct business between, say, the Nordics, UK, Germany, and the Baltics, which is where I was engaged at Vinted. So to bring that to life a little bit, for instance, the way people make decisions is very different, say in the UK versus Lithuania. So the UK, much like the US, tends to be a little bit more top down. Sort of as a leader, you're likely to get feedback from your teams around, you sort of socialize your ideas, but ultimately everyone knows you're expected to make a call, right? So that's kind of your role as a leader, and you sort of do that. In the Nordics, and in particular in Lithuania, it's very much a consensus-leaning culture. There's much more of an expectation to essentially stay in the room until everyone's on the same page. And so as a leader, you're expected to kind of create the circumstances for all opinions to be surfaced and sort of foster the debate up until you feel pretty confident that most folks are on the same page. This is obviously the opposite of how we teach decision making in traditional sort of business school settings. But actually, there's a lot of benefits to it, right? So it might take you longer, but once you have made a decision, everybody's kind of going in the same direction. If you operate in more of a top-down way, you probably are going to end up with some alignment issues, which is typically what we often see, I think, in a lot of UK companies. So long story short, like part of my role was to navigate these differences. We had executives from different cultures. Not every person's kind of sort of working practice is entirely analogous to their countries or cultural practice, but there were a lot of ways in which people just prefer to work differently. And obviously this happens at the exec level, but it happens all across the org. How direct the feedback people prefer to give to each other. British people tend to be more polite. Lithuanians were quite direct, for instance. So that was one big piece, navigating these cultural differences and landing people programs that may resonate with one constituency but not another. Another example that might be, I tried to implement this shout out program in my team, sort of like who lived our values. You could nominate your colleagues and we would sort of recognize someone who's really lived up to our values. And this felt like just kind of table stakes and like a normal recognition program to me. And it was a complete fail at Vinted. My sort of team, most of them were in Lithuania, were like, this makes no sense. We were really uncomfortable with this. Okay, this person did a good job, but they did a good job because all these other people helped them. Why aren't you calling those out too? So there was this like genuine discomfort with being singled out and recognized. So yeah, you have to sort of be culturally aware across the board. Operationally, it gets complex too. So like, give you an example, we had to figure out kind of our maternity, paternity, and parental leave policies. People have wildly different sort of ideas and expectations around these, not least because the regulations are different. So for instance, in Lithuania, the government is much more supportive, essentially funds much of people's maternity leave, whereas the UK is not at all generous. And so there's much more of a private market for higher mat leave. I had kind of a hard time selling the idea that this is something we need to pay attention to say fellow Lithuanian execs, because they just weren't familiar with the struggle, because there the government is much more helpful. Those are some of the sort of key things that come to mind.
And I've seen companies where, because of the geographic cultural differences, that they end up operating the geographies somewhat differently rather than trying to create a cohesive culture. And this is both operationally as well as with some of those other kind of systematic traditions that you're mentioning. And like parental leave is a great one where like, do we have different policies for different countries, or do we come up with like some consistent standard and then basically cover the difference around that? At Vinted, where did you land on that spectrum?
Yeah. So when it comes to most benefits, the primary objective was to be locally competitive. We did want to have a global kind of through line on some things, right? So we sort of philosophically believe that becoming a parent is an experience that many of our employees will go through during their time with us, and we don't want them to have a drastically different experience depending on which office they're based in or where they live. Due to kind of philosophical reasons, we decided to create something cohesive there, but this is not the case across the board. And I think that's probably the right approach in general. Some things you want to be consistent. Those things are close to your heart and sort of close to what sort of experience you're trying to create for your employees, but some things you maybe are not so worried about.
So it sounds like, hey, let's prioritize a few things that are representative of like what the company is and stands for. And then for the rest, you went with a local approach.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess that's a calculation that we would do in a US only organization as well, where California is very different than Texas, but the differences might be magnified in a Europe or in a broader environment. Jess is like, yes, you gave me a look.
Yeah, like, well,
yes,
for me, I was at
extremely.
Augusta where it was like US only. And then I went to Couchbase where we were operating in like 18 countries. And I was very fortunate. We had an incredible European HR leader, Toma, if you're listening, you're amazing. And she was helping to navigate all this stuff. But even things like I mentioned France, it's tricky. I mean, we offboarded somebody in France and I didn't know. I was like, oh, we need like every document to be translated into French. And we need someone to show up in person with the employee who's, French speaking. And we didn't have anybody on the team that could do that. And so we had to go find a third party. And so some of those things that I just wasn't aware of because the US doesn't have any equivalent to it. It was just like every country has their nuances around that stuff and at every stage. So it is definitely a needle to be thread through a lot of different eyes.
Yeah.
I was actually going to take things in a different direction, Andrew. I was curious because you were leading a team of 90 HR folks at the height of your time at Vinted. And I know there's some people in our audience who are leading much smaller teams than that. For those who haven't yet experienced leading a team of that size, what were some of your ahas or takeaways? And I feel like for some, it's like that 20 or 30 person mark where it really starts to feel different. For some, it's more like 50. But tell us more about what it means
Sure.
to lead a team at that scale.
The number one thing that I sort of learned is that the way you build trust is just very different. When you have a small team of direct reports, these folks experience you in the day to day. You have a one on one relationship with them. They understand you as a person and they see you as a person. When you have sort of a lot more people in the team, you're not able to have that kind of relationship with everybody. And so you become sort of a person they know of, but they don't necessarily know well. So I focused a lot on things like hosting a department all hands once a month. Took the opportunity to sort of update the team on, how is the company performing? How is the people team performing? How do our kind of goals and what we're achieving ladder up to what the company is trying to achieve? Keeping that slot consistently and speaking to the team in that way was very important. I also sort of did things like, wrote sort of long form letters in a similar vein to these all hands, but sometimes they were just important sort of turning points in the company story that needed a bit more nuanced and can come across through something like an all hands. Also, say quarterly skip level one-on-ones. I actually met with almost everybody in the people team, at least skip level, but if I recall, almost everybody at least once every 6 months or a year, sort of depending. Being a person that they still are able to speak to freely and really share their thoughts and feelings with. Obviously, I think in these roles, we make a lot of assumptions about what's going well and what's not going well. A lot of these folks are really the ones experiencing the pain. And so I think hearing it directly from them was really, really useful for me as well. So yeah, sort of building trust and being a visible leader is perhaps the biggest thing. The second thing is when you have a smaller team, it's much easier to collaborate, right? So if there's sort of something that isn't clear who owns it, well, you sit down and you figure it out, right? It doesn't take a lot of efforts to, say, collaborate on a project if it's sort of between the two of you. With 90 people, that just doesn't happen. It's easy to sort of run into silos where one team owns a project, but other teams get annoyed that, they're not being able to input into it, or they think that they should own it. Perhaps then too many people own it and then nothing ever gets done. So these sorts of things are way amplified when you have a bigger team. And so we sort of experimented with different structural models, like how can we break this down? How can we make sure that these silos don't happen? One of which was around creating squads based on kind of our key initiatives. One quarter, there may be, let's say, a comp program we're trying to launch, which has operational elements. It has people technology elements because the whole thing needs to be reflected in Workday. It has an element of sort of performance management because there may be a link to performance management too. So you would then basically put together these cross-functional squads that would come together and operate as a team and deliver these projects or products, if you will, and then disband in the end and sort of move on to the next big rock that sort of we figured out we needed to build. It's hard to sort of make work at this scale, but I think really it's the only way if you want to avoid silos. It's impossible to build a team where you sort of create a constitution where for the rest of time, everybody knows exactly what belongs in their arena and what doesn't. New things always come up, things change, context changes, and you have to reconstitute all the time and might as well get ahead of it and sort of build these sort of looser, more cross-functional teams. So that was sort of another very big difference, I think, to leading a smaller team.
Yeah, it sounds like there was like this infrastructure cadence around communication and providing context. And it moves from relationships of being one to one, where everybody gets to know you deeply and you get to know everybody deeply, and
Yep,
switches to one to many, where you need everybody to know you deeply, but you may not be able to get to know everybody else deeply, but you need inputs to be coming back towards you.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are some really powerful reflections on just what are some of these changes, especially as the team is scaling. And I love the point on using these cross-functional squads of sometimes, especially in times of lots of change, of how do you create structure with flexibility to be able to be nimble. And so that's another really great example of how to be able to do that.
Well, you've lived by leading both small and scaled teams. You've lived that founder's journey who started a tiny company with his or her friends. And now there are managers and VPs and department heads and people working all over the place. I really feel like more HR professionals would benefit from walking in the shoes of the business leaders that we're supporting. Like I sometimes like to say, like, you have your first claim of some sort, like, welcome to being a manager. Somebody's on a performance improvement plan, or you had to term somebody, or you had to deal with a complex issue. That doesn't happen that often for HR people to have to do themselves, because unless you're at a larger organization in a senior role, you don't have a whole lot of people working for you across
Yeah.
multiple levels. So like that firsthand experience, Daniel, I feel like really sets you up to be a more effective partner to the business leaders that you work with.
Yeah, I agree with that. So going through different functions kind of humbles you a little bit, right? You really have to learn everything from scratch. And it actually does help you hone these first principles thinking skills that we talked about earlier, and not sort of, yeah, not accept the playbooks. That's true for sure. I mean, when I hire people leaders myself, I really value experience spent outside of HR. It just helps folks see things in a new light, a new perspective, have more empathy for the kind of struggles that, frankly, sometimes sound annoying when listening to sort of a client as a people partner, as a people business partner. But if you've been in the shoes of that person, you understand where they're coming from, you understand where that pain comes from. And I think it's definitely helpful.
We often will complain to each other in the people roles. Why can't that leader just be clear with their expectations? Why can't they just give the constructive feedback to the person that is off track? And when you're living it, when you're the person having those conversations and you
Yeah.
hired that person and you're a little worried that they might quit and you might need to backfill the role, it is just different in real life than the theory of.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think having having experience from other parts of the business also just gives you that context, the deeper context to understand kind of the stakes, right? So let's say you have a policy, right, that you don't grant comp increases off cycle to someone, right? But there's this particular person that has an offer from somewhere, and their leader is sort of really trying to convince you to kind of make an exception. There's a few ways you can go here. Like you could just say, no, this is why we have a policy. But if you have that deep context of, okay, maybe this person truly is critical for the business, and you understand that because you understand exactly what they do. You're not just taking the leader's kind of opinion of them as face value, because of course every leader would say that, but you actually really do understand how important they are. Yeah, it might help you make a better decision, which may or may not be going off policy or staying within policy.
Love it. Really appreciate you sharing some of those insights. I've got just one or two more questions before we jump to our
Yeah.
accelerator round. One of the things that I'm always impressed about whenever we talk, you've completed some new degree. You recently completed an executive MBA, you have your Master of Laws, you have a very, very impressive set of degrees and certifications and accomplishments. And for our listeners who are mostly mid to senior level HR leaders that are trying to grow in their career, and you've had a great run, what role do you feel formal education has to play in that? Can you
Um,
draw a pie chart of, if you want to grow your career, where is formal education and where is the school of hard knocks and where are the other, elements that have helped you to achieve what you have?
yeah, I mean, maybe I'll focus on, just because it's sort of the most recent, and focus on business school. I'm actually going to come out and say something controversial, which is I think almost no HR leader would not benefit from a business degree. I just think that, kind of going back to the point I made earlier about, doing the rounds in a company, understanding how different departments work and what sort of problems they're dealing with, like, you can obviously learn that on the job. And I have in previous roles, but I always felt like there was kind of just a bit of a technical foundation missing, Like I could look at a P&L and sort of understand it, but like get a little bit lost when I was reading the financial section of, say, of our board deck, right? So, or I could talk about metrics within HR, but may not have been as confident, I don't know, thinking about how to set up an A/B test to kind of properly assess the success of an HR intervention. So long story short, I feel like there's so much value we can gain from learning these adjacent disciplines, whether that's finance and sort of being able to be a closer partner to the CFO and understanding sort of where they're coming from, and what things they care about and how do we come in. If you look at a P&L, like there's every line of that P&L you can essentially impact somehow as a people leader, whether that's, top line you can impact through go to market. Obviously, payroll is going to be one of the biggest contributors to the cost base. If you're a tech company, you have a big role to play there. So it just goes on and on, like really understanding kind of where you can create value for the company, which ultimately translates into valuation and shareholder value and whatnot, comes from understanding finance. And then, rather than throwing everything at a kitchen sink and seeing what sticks, you can be a lot more strategic about your interventions. If you sort of measure the impact of a particular, say, training program or leadership program, which goes beyond kind of did people enjoy the session, but actually like, is it translating into, say, if it's a leadership program, is it translating into better leadership effectively? If you're able to kind of do that because you have a little bit of a foundation in statistics and data analytics, I just think you'll go further as a people leader. I'm entirely sure that this is stuff that you can learn online too, and on the job, if you will, sort of just working with peers. But I personally found that really difficult because obviously you're always drowning in work. So if I didn't create this forcing mechanism in my life to get out of work, go to the school, be able to ask stupid questions all day and just learn from scratch, I don't think I would have been able to do it. So that's the kind of role it played for me.
Yeah. I love that because it's knowing what kind of learner you are too, right? What I'm hearing in that answer is other people might be able to learn just as much in other forms. And some people might appreciate multiple forms to be able to absorb this. But for you, you really have felt structured learning allowed you to elevate that learning curve the most. I love that awareness level. I can't believe this time has flown by so fast. Time for the accelerator round, which is just a few quick questions. And so the first one is speaking of learning, PLA loves high leverage learning. If you could only recommend like two resources to folks who are wanting to be people leaders or sitting in the role already, what two sources would make the cut for you?
Sure. So especially if you're leading an international company with folks across the world, I would highly recommend reading Aaron Mayer's The Culture Map, which is kind of my Bible for understanding cultural differences. It's a book that I've read through multiple times, but I also go back to it kind of as a handbook. So whenever I interact with folks from a particular country that I maybe don't know a whole lot about, I sort of go and prepare to see what sort of cultural differences might be lurking around the corner that I need to be aware of. Love that book. I think the Acquired podcast is also a great one. It's an in-depth history of businesses out there, including how business models have evolved, how sort of leadership impacted, in particular founders have impacted kind of these companies. I think you learn a lot about leadership and business in general from that one too.
Love it. The timing is fantastic because we're going to have an upcoming episode with somebody who actually focuses on teaching the culture map at Google.
I love
To a
that.
lot of the
Yeah.
teams on how to bridge that. And I am in the middle of the latest Acquired podcast. Their episodes are getting quite long, but it's on Trader Joe's and it is fascinating. I thought I knew about Trader Joe's, but like, holy cow, the twists and turns. So that's an excellent one as well, Acquired. Okay, next question. What one sentence of advice can you share with folks about how to accelerate a successful HR career in today's environment?
Yeah. Tinker with AI. And in fact, build something with Lovable. I go so far as to say that. Every CEO these days wants an AI first HR leader, even though I think AI first HR leaders don't exist. AI curious HR leaders do. And I think you'd be very well advised to come across as one.
Yeah, and the bar for that continues to come lower and lower, so it's more
Yeah.
and more accessible, which is awesome. I'd say the only people leader that I've seen so far who comes like pretty close is at Zapier. Brandon Samet has put out a lot of stuff on that I think is really fascinating.
Hugh Hamarani has done a lot at high level, and
Yeah.
I've embarrassed myself on Lovable as well.
Yeah, Mobile's awesome. Actually, I'll just put a shout out to Marianne Chahi, who's like their head of people out there. I hired her at Gusto and she ended up taking over as
Amazing.
head of people after me. So yes, lots of love for Lovable. Okay, last but not least, how can our listeners connect with you?
Sure. LinkedIn's probably best. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. Please send me a connect. I'll accept. And looking forward to connecting with you.
Daniel, really appreciate you speaking with us. I know it's late your time as well. Thanks so much for sharing your learnings, your wisdom, your journey with us. If only we could have a similar path that you've had. Lots of learnings along the way, I'm sure.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate you so much.
Thank you very much for your time. Really, really enjoyed this. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of People Leader Accelerator Podcast, where we talk with business and HR leaders about what makes great leadership and great work. We hope you walked away with at least one game-changing insight for you and your team. You can find show notes and free bonus resources at peopleleaderaccelerator.com/podcast. If today's conversation sparked something for you, hit subscribe, leave a quick review, and share this episode with that one colleague who really needs to hear it. You know who I'm talking about. And if you're currently navigating the tricky waters of hiring top talent, developing leaders who actually lead, or building a culture that fuels growth, let's talk. You can find us at peopleleaderaccelerator.com. We're here to help you and your team not just survive, but truly thrive. I'm Jess Yuen, and on behalf of my co-host, Andrew Bartlow, thanks for investing your valuable time with us. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. Until next time, keep learning and keep leading.